Okay, so next up we have Shane Faulkner, who's going to be talking about when linear regressions don't work, data-driven cyanobacterial risk assessment for the real world.
Not sure if the presentation was loaded up, so I brought a spare.
Yeah, it doesn't look like it. Okay, I'll let you find it then.
It's nothing on it. Good afternoon, Shane Faulkner, Water New South Wales. Always exciting to be following Stuart Kahn's presentations. Generally, I suspect mine are a bit more underwhelming. I guess what we're looking at here today is as part of the Water New South Wales Act in 2014, there's been a merger of a number of operational functions for water management in New South Wales. So Water New South Wales came into being at that time, and effectively as part of that now, we're now supplying I think over 2/3 of the regulated water in New South Wales to customers across around 35, maybe 40 odd dams and other control structures throughout the state. So we operate in terms of raw water supply for Greater Sydney to Warragamba Dam, that sort of thing, to look after raw water for Sydney Water. We operate a water utility out around the Lithgow area in the Fish River system, and pretty much for the rest of the state we're pretty much focused on capture, store, release for irrigation. So we sort of have a fairly wide range of responsibilities here, but I guess the thing that links all of that together is that we're in water management. So as part of that, our operators and maintenance staff have to, plan for activities into the coming year, as well as the water utility side of things have to plan in terms of water treatment, and whether or not they have to, bring in more information for their own risk management strategies. So on a year-to-year basis, we're asked to provide a cyanobacterial risk forecast, and obviously the uses of that water are functionally different. Recreational risk sits in terms of our rural storages, and in terms of our metropolitan, we're looking at the drinking water supplies. We also had to communicate that in a simple way, because in customers we're dealing in some respects with irrigators, in some respects with holiday parks. Water utilities obviously have a higher knowledge base, but we needed to have some way to bring this all together. And basically the major challenge at the time was pretty much what we had was effectively a reliance on expert opinion to inform that risk assessment. Lots of great photos from around the state, and most of this stuff has come through in the last year or two, so it just underpins why it's important to be as close to right on this as possible. So in terms of the disparity between what we do in terms of the metropolitan areas and what we do in terms of recreational irrigation areas, our monitoring program effectively is described there. Now in the metropolitan areas we do monthly, and at highly critical sites we'll do fortnightly algal samples, speciation, we'll do toxin analysis as well if that's required. Basically we'll have the nutrient data, although I did hear 5 minutes ago that the nutrient data is a bit of a waste of time, but that's fine, we'll move on from that. But effectively being a raw water supplier, trying to optimise the quality of raw water for somebody that's treating water for nearly 5 million people, small savings in water quality do ultimately parlay into big savings in terms of financial for the government. On the recreational and irrigation side of things, our staff do the sampling. Often they're constrained by workplace health and safety requirements. Some of our, pardon me, a bit of a cold, sites only have one staff member at the site. We need 2 people on site to be able to do boat work to grab algal samples. So we'll often have to have somebody drive over for 5-6 hours, go do the algal sample, probably stay overnight and then head back, which obviously isn't particularly efficient. But the reality of our position is that the data we collect in terms of rural storage is effectively paid for by the irrigation councils across the state. We don't have a lot of resources there. So the problem we've got here is we needed to look, at a risk assessment strategy where on one side of the coin we've got a lot of data, great historical database. On the other side we've got at best monthly data because of our obligations under the guidelines that Stuart mentioned earlier. We do amp up to weekly sampling, but then that causes problems in terms of staff resourcing, staff availability, getting samples to appropriate labs, etc., etc. So there is a real resource planning argument that underpins, the way we have to look at this. And again, it gets down to the reason why we need it to be fairly rigorous. So we looked at a lot of different alternatives here and a lot of different ways we could look at it. Basically, the more we did covariate work, and this is predominantly on the metropolitan storages where we did have a lot of data, we realised the more we looked at a certain covariate and thought, yes, this is the thing that's really describing our cyanobacterial risk, we'd get to the next year and find out, no, it's not. And this has been going on for a fairly long period of time. In terms of the rural storages, we don't have anything. We've got the cyanobacterial data, we've got some basic hydrometric data that our customers are required, that our customers want to see, obviously to ensure that we're regulating the system in an appropriate way and basically they're getting what they're paid for. But as I said before, the challenge is we've got to come up with a methodology that was consistent across all of the storages we deal with. Oop, wrong way. So, part of the project, we looked at what the relevant risk factors were, and in this case, for drinking water, it's staying within, I guess, the prescribed guidelines and our supply agreements with the Sydney metropolitan customers, and also the customers we have in the Shoalhaven area as well, and also the Southern Highlands. We developed thresholds for each risk factor, and we looked at basically how much data we had and effectively what was low, medium, high risk for basic drinking water supply, but also for a recreational user. We then effectively normalised the data that we did have and the things that we felt that from a covariate perspective were feeding into that risk and brought it into something that was, we could basically effectively develop a simplified additive model. From the back end of that, we used the last 12 months worth of data because obviously since when Water New South Wales started in 2014, we're still in the process of bringing through the data from some of our legacy organisations. It didn't look like a complicated problem at the time, but even somebody misspelling Cylindrus spermopsis suddenly causes an issue with trying to bring over 20 years worth of data. So it's a work in progress. We have new data management systems in place that are hopefully going to alleviate that issue, but what we've got right now is what we've got right now. So, but off the back end of all of that, hopefully we're able to come up with a risk level for each storage, which we then applied a level of validation, which I'll come to further in the presentation. So the risk factors were based on data availability, as mentioned before, and reality is in terms of the rural, I guess being the lowest common denominator, we sort of had to look at the metropolitan sites in that context as well, but given we had more data, we could effectively verify and validate the model output further down the track. One thing we do have a large abundance of in terms of the rural business is all the hydrometric data, and we looked at the variables there that we felt could influence cyanobacterial prevalence, selectivity and possibly abundance, and really inflow volumes and relationships to storage levels and also stratification status, I guess as a surrogate for nutrient fluxing back into the water column. Again, this is what you do when you don't have a lot of data to work with, unfortunately. On looking at all of that data though, then we realised that a lot of the data had been collected for operational purposes, so there needed to be a whole range of data cleansing routines. In the metropolitan business, we tended to focus more on composite samples, grabbing something that effectively represented the entire euphotic depth. In the rural business, we've got the guy that drives the tractor collecting samples for us. He doesn't have the equipment for it. He might have a hose. We've explained to him how to use the hose to grab a hose sample. But again, we're working with guys that this is not their core business. So more often than not, we tell them, look, find a nice clean part of the water where you're sampling from. We don't want you collecting algal scum samples, especially if that's not representative of the broader lake. Grab your sample, surface dip, that'll be fine. Bring it back, we'll analyse and we'll work with that. But that meant then when we're comparing results between different reservoirs, we needed some way to bring the disparity of sampling back into something that was a bit more cogent. So the current guidelines we operate to, Stuart mentioned before about the NHMRC guidelines, in relation to microcystis and obviously in relation to biovolume. There is a guideline for toxins that sits within the recreational space, but we don't analyse for it. Again, this is really a funding question at the end of the day. Although I did hear earlier that there were some interesting technologies coming through in relation to toxin analysis that might be something that we could look at into the future. In terms of drinking water storages, look, some of those numbers there will definitely be familiar to you. I guess the way we operate in relation to Sydney is very risk averse. The view being that if the raw water can be kept at a level that meets Australian drinking water guidelines, then everything that follows that in terms of the treatment train obviously ensures that we're staying right away from anything that could be considered harmful. So then we looked at, I guess, what the thresholds were and basically how effectively they related to our period of record. And here's some data here from Pindari Dam, and look, you can see here it does go fairly ordinary for a period of time, usually over the summer months. For the guys here like Lee, that would be familiar with Pindari. No real surprises there whatsoever. Then we looked at, I guess, the proportion of samples that were sitting above those relative thresholds, and again, just bringing this back into a simplified additive matrix. So we then plotted all of that against the percentages of each samples exceeding that, and as you can see with Pindari, which is in the north of the state, the common joke about Pindari is for 3 months of the year you don't need a boat, you can just walk over it because the cyanobacterial biomass is that thick, it's ridiculous. But as you can see, it's definitely sitting up the higher end of the spectrum. Looking at the rest of the data set across the other 14 or 15 dams, I guess we're managing in the rural business, we put those thresholds in terms of the percentage of samples so that when we got to the additive matrix, effectively we could look at it and go, is this all making sense? Does this fit what we know about our dams? So then we looked at how that all related in terms of those different levels of risk in relation to the various hydrological characteristics that we do have. And again, for Pindari, we've come off a hydrologically active cycle in New South Wales. In 2015, 2016, we were fairly full. Since then, obviously, the droughts kicked in and everything's come down. But usually, as an irrigation dam, we operate in the capture, store, release space. Once we've got it on board, customers start to buy their water per their water licences, and effectively we release it almost immediately. So it is not unusual for dams to fill right up in the rural space, depending on how the licensing for that valley has been orientated, and come back down again fairly rapidly. And then obviously as the volumes recede, effectively people are not actually able to purchase water, and hence why we have most of the issues in the rural business right now. So we looked, I guess, at how those exceedances in terms of amber and red alerts fit into the various hydrological characteristics we had. And from that, again, we tried to normalise that into a risk matrix. So here we have, I guess, from the recreational side of things, how the weightings worked out. And look, basically, there was no science really to this. This was more, let's put it all on the table. Let's see how the weightings work. Fine, that fits very nicely. No, hang on, that doesn't fit. We're overestimating that. That's causing a result that at the end of the day doesn't really make sense. So we came back and looked at the weightings again. And then we used the same sort of methodology again and again and again until we got to a point where we looked at the dams and went, okay, based on what we're hearing from the people that operate holiday parks, the operators at who operate each system, the maintenance staff who are at each site, is this making sense to everybody in terms of the relative risk between each of these 14 odd dams? So those percentages don't look particularly large in terms of the percentage of samples over a year, but having said that, in most cases if we don't have an alert, we're collecting 12 samples due the year, just to meet our obligations under various deeds of agreement with other regulatory agencies. If we go to an alert period, we could be looking at, say, over a 3-month period, collecting a dozen samples. There is some variability there between the frequency of sampling, and we found that parlayed directly into the percentage of samples collected. But again, we brought back the parameterisations that we had data on that we knew we could work with. So then we tried to apply a similar methodology over to the drinking water systems, knowing full well that we had a lot more data to verify the methodology. Similar approach, exceedances were calculated relative to the drinking water guidelines, toxin concentration, and in case of the metropolitan storages, we had very good stratification data. In some of the rural dams, we had that, others we didn't. So it was a debate about whether or not to include that or not. And from the back end of that, we ended up with, I guess, a similar rating, a similar threshold level running down the system. With the Sydney metropolitan storages, there tend to be fairly good quality raw water, so the percentages are arbitrarily lower. The reality is we have a fairly significant catchment management program that operates for Sydney's drinking water in terms of the raw water storages. In the rural business, pretty much anything goes. We don't have any regulatory function, unfortunately, above the dam in terms of what landholders up there may or may not be doing. We have input into various discharge licences, for example, sewage treatment plants, but other than that, we don't have any, I guess, stick, effectively, for catchment management. So the end result, basically, was we came out with this, and that effectively fit Under the old Sydney Catchment Authority paradigm, or Sydney Catchment Authority organisation, we did various risk assessments at various points using a whole range of data. And generally, we felt we had a pretty good feel for that because we've been using this risk assessment approach and traffic lighting it accordingly for a number of years. When we applied that similar type of traffic light methodology to the rural business, we asked ourselves, does this actually make sense given what we know about these dams? So these results were taken out to the guys on the ground and said, what do you think? And look, there was a little bit of my dam's worse than your dam going on. But overall, I think everybody felt that we got to a fairly cogent place, which for us was a good outcome because I guess this we felt is very communicatable to our stakeholders, whether that happens to be a holiday park, a landholder, a minister. The bottom line was this was something that was very simple to communicate, and we're very confident we can look back at that in 12 months and go, it made sense. So, bottom line was, we think this is reproducible. Having said that, we've used 2 or 3 years worth of data to train this. We've run the methodology for 12 months. We now have gone from a fairly hydrologically active time to somewhere where we don't expect we're going to be hydrologically active. So I think the next 12 months will be very interesting to see how well these risk forecasts have come through. Reality was, one of the purposes for choosing a lot of this data was there may be the potential in the future if we could refine the methodologies to update it in real time, because most of that data is the cyanobacterial data is a little bit more complicated, but all the hydrological data is available in quasi-real time. So you effectively could update this matrix as the data kept coming in, which we felt, in terms of a seasonal forecast, probably not that useful, but if you wanted to refine the time step down to say a month or two, that might be quite useful. And obviously being concise, we churned through a fairly large data set across a whole range of dams to make this happen in a fairly short time frame. The good thing was, given the complexity of the data that we were dealing with and how the data is not strictly speaking fit for purpose, we had something that effectively made sense and we could communicate it pretty clearly. So, as mentioned before, next thing will be to see how we went. I guess I'll come back in 6 months and maybe not let you know. I guess we can investigate whether or not there are additional parameterisations we can throw into this, but at this stage, I guess that's partially dependent on how well we did with the previous forecast. We would like to plug in some of the broader level stuff, like the bomb seasonal forecasts and things like that, but again, there is a bit of a mismatch there. The hydrology may be important than the seasonality. The seasonality may be more important than the hydrology. Again, until we start to test this over the next few years, it's pretty hard to say. And look, we may adapt new thresholds, obviously, depending on how Stuart goes with his review of the recreational guidelines over the next few years. So, otherwise, thank you very much for your time.
Do you have any temperature-based interrelationships in risk? For example, we work in a number of blooms 30 to 36 degrees,
yep.
And quite often you'll also see serious blooms of Naglaria or else quite high levels of something like Legionella.
Yep.
So are you getting those patterns, or is it just high temperature relationships that we see?
We really haven't gotten to high temperature or any sort of temperature monitoring apart from just the broader level seasonality. Just the expectation that at this stage, for the higher risk dams in particular, we move through to the warmer months. There will be a requirement for them to ramp up in terms of resourcing. It's a difficult thing, but yeah, like to, but unfortunately we don't. One of the interesting things we have noticed about some of our dams is that per the guidelines, where we have an access site to a storage is where we do our recreational monitoring. Fantastic, but some of the dams are quite large, and what we've found is the biomass moves around the storage. So we could collect data like that and start to, I guess, look at that as a covariate, but we still need some way to sensibly bring in the spatiality of the distribution of that biomass across the dam. And at this stage, some dams do it, some dams don't. Definitely has something to do with the morphology of the dam. Effectively, what it looks like. If it's a big open plate, yeah, it definitely shifts around. Some of the more constrained dams that are in gorges, etc., less so. So we did look at that back in the day around the metropolitan business and tested that, and we found, and again, I don't want to contradict anything that's been presented here earlier today, but we did find that in terms of some of the metropolitan dams, nitrogen was probably our best indicator. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.